So what I would like us to do is maybe we just have to put that plan to the following and use the coming week.
Hello?
Identify the money and those things, because every day Trevor have things, every day I have things. You don't say, and in a
Check. Mic 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 check. All right, I'm gonna end this now.
I said turn off that damn light. Who the hell are you? Guys, sick of you trashing this neighborhood. Well, if you're gonna do something.
Everyone, thank you so very much for joining us for the Press Association of Jamaica's public forum gone virtual. I'm Dionne Miller, a director of the Press Association of Jamaica, and I'll be your moderator for the evening, also one of your presenters. Now, every year when the Global Press Freedom Index comes out and Jamaica comes, high up as we always do in the top 10, we get two sets of calls and messages. One set from people complimenting us on our high press freedom ranking, the other set from people cussing and saying we don't deserve it. And in fact, that's what we're interrogating this evening. Does Jamaica deserve its high press freedom ranking? By way of background, Jamaica is described by Reporters Without Borders, that's a group that does the Global Press Freedom Index, as among the countries that most respect freedom of information. Our current ranking is 6, and we ranked 8th in 2019, and that's still impressive when you look at the list of 184 countries. So whether that ranking is deserved, as I said, is what our panelists will be exploring for you this evening. We ask you to tweet along with us. Our hashtags for the evening are PAJ Forum 2021 and Press Freedom JA. Now, let me first introduce our panelists. We have with us integration editor at the Gleaner, Damion Mitchell. We have also program director lecturer, the Bachelor of Arts in Communication Arts and Technology at the University of Technology, Jamaica, Marilyn Facey, and senior communication strategist for the Jamaica Constabulary Force, Dennis Brooks, will be zooming in as per so much of what we're doing in the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll also, as I said, be giving a short presentation. Before you hear from them, though, we have to welcome our sponsors. And we have with us from the British High Commission, His Excellency Asif Ahmad, and also with us from the Canadian High Commission, Political Counselor Kevin Gilhooly. We're also pleased to welcome from the European Union delegation, Ambassador Marion Van Steen, and we'll be hearing from them in just a little while. All three make a point of supporting press freedom and the Press Association of Jamaica, and we're so pleased to have you all with us here this evening. Before anyone speaks, though, I'd like to invite the president of the Press Association of Jamaica, George Davis, to give a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Dionne. So good afternoon again to those here, dignitaries. Very good to have you, and the team that support you at your various missions. Good to have you here as well. Those of us watching, well, those of you watching on JNN or through the stream that we provided, welcome as well. The PAJ welcomes your presence and your contribution towards an event that has become a highlight of the annual Journalism Week agenda. I'm saying thanks to all our sponsors who've kept faith with us and put money into this year's celebration of National Journalism Week. Indeed, there is no company executive alive, I can say without fear of contradiction, in Jamaica who would have known a tamarind season more sour or longer than the one we have been in since about March last year. The diplomatic community has been very kind to us. Corporate Jamaica has been very kind to us and have collaborated to make this year's celebration possible at a time when several entities have had to shelve plans for the showpiece event on their respective calendars due to a lack of funds. The PAJ is grateful. The topic for this forum is a natural motion for a debate, and Dionne just explained why, but if it missed you, I'll go again. It's natural because the argument around it needs no prompting. There are people who are proud of and accepting of the work done by Reporters Without Borders and the placement of Jamaica at number 6 in the world. Then there are others who say the ranking is palpably false given the things that are apparent to them in the immediate environment. Now, with two naturally differing views on the topic, I suspect we are in for a very good evening, especially when we get to the comments from those who are on social media. I will close by saying that I firmly believe the rank of 6 to be a fair and accurate declaration of the state of press freedom in Jamaica. There is always plenty to chide governments for, especially in Jamaica, but there can be no argument that the work of successive PNP and the JLP administrations has helped to create the environment for the local press to work with the latitude it has enjoyed over time. And I want to be perhaps the first PAJ president to hail publicly all the men and women who have served the organization, leading teams whose work has helped us to be having this debate about whether Jamaica deserves to be listed among the world's elite in the area of press freedom. And so, if you bear with me quickly, I'll say thanks to Theodore Seeley, H.P. Jacobs, P.E. Trotman, Halgrave, Hector Bernard, Clifton Nita, all fall down, J.C. Prout, Canute James, Clarence Ben Brody, Clifton Segree, Gladstone Wilson, Franklin McKnight, Patrick Harley, Jennifer Grant, Desmond Allen, Donna Ortega, Glenn McFarlane, Desmond Richards, Byron Buckley, Jenny Campbell. Dionne Jackson-Miller is still a part of the executive. She served as president. I want to say thanks to her because it is on the shoulders of these ladies and gentlemen that we are in a position to be having this debate, and they have contributed significantly to where we are now. And well, we'll explore the merit or otherwise of this rank in the time to come. But it's always useful to say thanks, and that's how I'm concluding my greetings this afternoon.
Thank you so much, George. And you know, out of every bad comes some good. And one of the things I'm pretty sure that this pandemic is going to leave with us is this kind of blended approach to these kinds of presentations. I was looking in the Zoom and already I'm seeing Dr. Hume Johnson, who is joining us from the United States. I see Attorney Matonda Makula joining us from the UK. I see as well Franklin McKnight, one of our colleagues. And as I also always delight in telling people, my geography teacher in high school, one of the best teachers I ever had. So at this point, I'd like to invite His Excellency Asif Ahmad, the UK High Commissioner, to bring us greetings.
Well, thank you very much. Customary to start these presentations with acknowledgement of the dignitaries, but may I do something in reverse, which is greetings to members of the media, because usually it's a bit of an afterthought when speakers line up in the hope that they'll get a good write-up after the speech has been made. I really want to add my congratulations to Jamaica's rankings. Yes, there are challenges, but it is no mean feat to consistently hit that sweet spot, and you must be doing many things right. So if you hear anything that sounds like criticism, please take it as constructive or at least just another opinion, if nothing else. You know, we, together with Canada and also joined by the European Union, cherish global media freedom, and we've been running a campaign which is now in its third year. And just a few weeks ago, we re-invited Jamaica because I told you last year that we hoped that Jamaica would join our global campaign, and at that time people were preoccupied. And Minister Favour Williams had a conversation with my namesake, Lord Ahmed, and they've thought about it, and Jamaica is not quite ready to focus on this given that there are understandable priorities. But you know, journalism and freedom is a very precious thing, and maybe time is not always going to be right. It's been a very tough year for journalists, another tough year. You know, we've lived through 4 years of this whole fake news and alternative facts scenario. Russia is back again in chasing down freedom. We see China, Hong Kong, where really the battle from the streets is now being held in other spheres, including media. It's sort of gone off the headlines, but we still watch what's going on in Belarus. My last posting in the Philippines, where Maria Ressa, my dear colleague, who I spent many, many hours on camera with, has had a lawsuit after lawsuit in the hope that one of them will stick. So yes, Jamaica can be proud, and it's really up to you as professionals to argue whether it's justified or not. I see areas where I think it is not just alive and kicking, I think it is actually thriving. And the sector that I'm most impressed with is radio, because in many parts of the world, it's sort of almost going out of fashion. But here it is really lively. The interrogation, sometimes I have interviewed people who have a packed full of statistics and figures and things, and your head sort of spins. You know how well researched it is. And you have that direct public interaction where people are phoning in, and the time delay might save you a little bit from something terrible being said, but I really see it alive. On television, I've also had one or two interesting encounters, not only arguing about football and the relative merits of our football teams, but I've been locked up in a dark room in conversation. But that really is a hard talk. And I'm glad that you can actually pin people down and subject them to that sort of interrogation. Social media, of course, is your competitor, it is your multiplier, it is your friend, it is also a source for news. It's not unusual nowadays for tweets to turn themselves into, I'm hearing myself twice, which is really interesting. I don't know which one I agree with, actually. But this crossover between social media and traditional media and this uncontrolled factor that's out there is a huge, huge challenge. And you know, we've seen the specter of people using YouTube, Facebook, and all sorts of messaging. A lot of it quite dangerous and harmful. The print media, I think, is really still under severe stress. And I mentioned this last year. This is a global phenomenon. The idea that you needed people with deep pockets, patrons, if you like, to keep newspapers alive, is there to some extent, but it is now becoming extremely difficult with advertising revenues, with people using alternative sources for news, the paywall not always working as well as it should. And you see it, you feel it in your hands. Some of my favorite newspapers, which in England I used to sit and sometimes spend my entire Sunday going through cover to cover. I find I get through it really quickly because there isn't a lot there. And there are some newspapers here really that I also sometimes, some mornings, I wonder whether I actually have read it or not, because it's difficult to fill it with content. So that's the challenge of revenue draining away and people being unwilling to pay. And I also wonder what on earth you would print if you did not have Reuters and AP and others to feed off. You know, the back pages, the front pages would be very, very bare. And if it wasn't for some advertising and a few letters and op-eds, it would really start to look very, very bare. And it must be quite disheartening for journalists whose trade is crafted over many years with strong sub-editors really grooming them and shaping them, only to find that they really do not have the space. People say that people self-censor because of fear of litigation. I think that is true in many places. Investigative journalism, I think, really is important and should be encouraged, and what I call sustained investigative journalism, not just one big flash story without the counterpoint and without some of the context coming through. You know, quality journalism is something you know when you read it, you know when you see it, and I'd like to see a lot more of that here, because there are great writers in Jamaica, but they're not always getting the platform that they need. I'm puzzled here by the letters, I must confess, because I sometimes, if not always, read identical letters in both newspapers. Either they're extremely good letters, which I'm not sure is always true, or it means that not many people choose to write in, which is quite sad, because it is a great way of people getting their message across. Just a couple of days ago, I saw something about the state of the Zimbabwe health system being printed. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but really, does the Jamaican reader want to find out what's going on in the Zimbabwean health sector? Maybe I'm misinformed. Op-eds can be good. Sometimes they are express opinions and using the freedom that you have to express things, which I think if quality control was more severe, might never make daylight, because they're really, some of them are truly wacky. And I'll give you a personal example, a very short one. I was, in my previous career, a business consultant under a government agency, and a newspaper journalist, a pair of them, followed me, seeing my clients for a whole week. And I proudly went to buy the Sunday Times after doing my groceries. And I opened the pack, and the headline was "Business Link, my organization, under fire." And I thought Monday was going to be a very bad day when I had to resign, because this would be full of negativity. The story was wholly positive. Right at the end, a throwaway line. Some people still question the viability of Business Link, and that turns into the headlines. And you've had some recent commentary about headlines in Jamaica, about where it is. You know, people don't like reading headlines that really grab you where you shouldn't be. And sometimes, if not often, it's justified. Sometimes it's a distillation of what you've said. At other times, people can get it wrong. And this is where I urge sub-editors and others to be very watchful. I was truly sad to see one of the oldest newspapers in the Caribbean effectively baying for the demise of Her Majesty the Queen when the headline "God dumped the Queen" was splashed across the headline. By all means, argue for the change of your head of state. You're totally entitled, but do not ask for a head of a person on a plate. So we are here We're passionate about global media freedom because I think informed citizens make better countries. Both local and global news is important, and global issues that sometimes may not be popular are actually vital, climate change being one of them. Democracy, so fragile and yet essential, would not survive without a free press. Advocacy is also important so that people with a passion can get their news across. And then support for the economy, because a lot of sentiment about a country is derived from what press cuttings and what the searches on the internet from faraway places will actually show you. And last but not least, it is also about entertainment. And that's one of the things I find truly special here in Jamaica. The newspapers and media are rarely short of real good entertainment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. Okay, so I've now learned that even if your phone is on mute, when you go onto YouTube, the volume is still going to come up. And now I'm afraid to turn on my phone. So, all right, so let me say as well, welcome to past President Desmond Richards, who is in the Zoom with us. Also, we always get great support from the University of Technology students, and I'm seeing some of them in the room, but I think for the first time, we have a cohort from Northern Caribbean University. So special welcome to the Introduction to Journalism group. We are so happy to have you. We look forward to hearing you in the question and answer. And some of our longtime supporters, I mean, people like Faye Ellington, people like Jean Lord, who always support our events. We're so happy we're able to accommodate you and to have you still with us through the Zoom. At this point, let me ask to join us to again bring greetings from the Canadian High Commissioner, Political Counselor, Kevin Gilhooly.
Good evening, everybody. To my colleague, Ambassador Marianne Van Steen, good evening. To my colleague, Saif Ahmed, High Commissioner of the United Kingdom in Jamaica. To other representatives of the Diplomatic Corps. To Ms. Dionne Jackson-Miller, the moderator. To Mr. George Davis, President of the Press Association of Jamaica, and other members of the executive. Distinguished speakers and panelists. Representatives of the media. I should have started probably there, as my colleague did. Ladies and gentlemen all, good evening. As Chargé d'Affaires for the Canadian High Commission, it is indeed a great honor to be part of this celebration that marks National Journalism Week in Jamaica. I would like to start by commending members of the media, the Jamaican government, civil society, and the people of Jamaica on this milestone achievement that has seen Jamaica rise from number 6 place to on the World Press Freedom Index. I would like to thank the Press Association of Jamaica for holding this event this evening. It's an important forum that is being convened in an era where even greater demands have been placed on the media. The Jamaican press has continued to pursue freedom and transparency, and it has commanded the attention and respect of the international media community. The work that they do is truly important. In the words of Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, independent fact-based reporting is vital. Few professions have the power and the responsibility to enrich conversations, open people to new ideas and perspectives, and widen the lens on the challenges we face. By doing so, the Jamaican press has gained a strong reputation within the international community. The COVID-19 pandemic has challenged Jamaica's press to remain a forceful and relevant and a key provider of information for Jamaicans as we navigate these difficult pandemic times together. During this critical time, we need to stand together to protect and promote media freedom. I would point out that Canada has been concerned with the effects of COVID-19, the effects that COVID-19 has had on media freedom in some parts of the world. We have noted with unease a troubling trend towards undue restrictions and free expression by some governments. However, I'd like to point out that in a world where media freedom is increasingly under challenge, Jamaica's press has carved out a space where it's accurate, impartial media reporting has served a fundamental public interest. As for Canada, advancing democracy continues to be a core value that underpins our foreign policy and will continue to be a cornerstone of our diplomacy and international assistance. We continue to support the media's contribution to advancing democracy, accountable governance, peaceful pluralism, gender equality, and respect for diversity, human rights, and the rule of law. To this end, we continue to lend support to local media to help uphold these values. The Government of Canada is contributing to media freedom through its Pro-Dem initiative, which has pledged $10 million Canadian over 5 years to promote and protect democracy. $1 million Canadian dollars of this Pro-Dem initiative has been committed to the new Global Media Defence Fund, agreed to at the conference we co-hosted with the UK in 2019, which will strengthen media protection and support journalists under fire. As you may also know, Canada introduced the Global Pledge on Media Freedom, which links 32 like-minded countries to work together on identifying and acting on violations and abuses of the rights of members of the press, including through the establishment of ministerial-level the Media Freedom Coalition. The High Commission of Canada would like to recognize the investigative journalism that has been carried out by the Jamaican press, despite limited resources. This is the kind of journalism that unearths critical political, economic, and social issues, questions decisions, and brings clarity in the pursuit of truth. It holds governments and others accountable. For Canada this evening, the forum is significant. As we think about the current situation, we must reflect on the challenge we face in Canada, in Jamaica, and globally. In this era, we are asking, how do you maintain media freedom and how do you remain factual in a world where journalism is often under threat? Indeed, the press does not always hold favorable views about the government. Canada is no exception in this regard. However, quality investigative journalism may lead to uncomfortable situations for government officials, but journalists must seek balance and truth, and governments must accept the role of media, whether favorable or unfavorable. In all this, Canada remains concerned that violations of rights of freedom of expression continue to occur. There are worrying trends across the world towards undue restrictions on free expression online, resulting from measures taken by some governments to censor or control digital technologies. On behalf of the Government of Canada, I thank all journalists in this country and around the world who reveal injustices and give us straight facts that allow us to think more freely and critically about the world around us. To the Press Association of Jamaica, thank you for involving Canada in this week's activities. A united effort can only strengthen our collective response to those who seek to undermine the essential work of journalism. Now more than ever, we must protect media freedom and support the free exchange of information. Thank you, merci, et bonsoir.
Thank you so much, sir. And without giving too much away, you may be pleased to see that Canada actually will feature in my presentation. So that's something to look out for. Can I now invite from the EU delegation to join us, Her Excellency Ambassador Marion Van Steen.
Thank you very much. I'll start with saying good evening to the members of the media. And of course, Mr. George Davis, President of the Press Association of Jamaica, the Executive of the Press Association, and the members of the panel, not to forget. Of course, also to my colleagues, Asif, Kevin. It is really a pleasure for me to be here, and I would like to thank you for the opportunity to address a couple of words at the beginning of this so important panel. I'm very proud that I can do that together with my Canadian and my UK colleagues, and it shows how much that we are like-minded on this specific subject. The European Union, speaking on behalf, is indeed very pleased to partner up with the Press Association of Jamaica to celebrate, even a bit later than that was initially foreseen, the Journalism Week 2020 under the theme Safeguarding Press Freedom in the Pandemic. I want to congratulate the Press Association of Jamaica for turning the spotlight on the journalism profession, which, as you know, plays every day a more critical role in the proper functioning of our democracies. More and more, we are witnessing that democracies are not a given anymore. We need to work on it every day, and the role of the media has become and is becoming every day more important. The focus of tonight's discussion is about free press and whether Jamaica deserves its high rank. Those who are more expert than me will discuss that later on in the panel, but I would very much like to use this opportunity to invite to reflect on a couple of questions which may go beyond the question of whether Jamaica deserves or not, but I think they're very important questions in this debate. First of all, how the concept of free press has been impacted by the power of disinformation, call it fake news, or how the freedom of expression has been shown to have an increasing impact through the use of social media on the fundamentals of democracy itself. Second question, how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting the health and well-being of media workers, of journalists who are out there. They are in the front lines and they're risking their health for doing their job. And three, how the pandemic is making social media flourish to the detriment of traditional media, and how difficult it has become for traditional media and, let's say, qualified journalists to survive, to struggle economically in this changing 21st century. The roundtable tonight is about a very necessary debate about not only ensuring free press, but also about the ensuing threats of living in societies where all of a sudden, not only the prepared media, but every single citizen has gotten the right to express his or her opinion. The debate that is necessary, even in a country where fortunately the situation has not come close to threaten democracy, is about how traditional media and well-trained journalists can level up the accurateness of the information reaching society. Suppose that within the context of COVID-19, Jamaicans did not have free access to accurate information about what's happening in the country, about what's happening in the region, about what's happening in the world. Or if they would have access to information, but the information would not be accurate, then people would be denied vital information which they need to make informed decision on whether to wear masks, on whether to distance socially, on whether to take a vaccine ultimately. They may put in question why the government is starting to limit their liberties. They may not accept them. They may actually not accept anything like a curfew, or they may lose their employment and they may blame whom is not really the one to blame. Thankfully, Jamaica has an excellent record in terms of press freedom. It has been said before, being ranked 6th in the world on the Press Freedom Index is far better than many developed countries. Congratulations. And it's also far better than many of the member countries of the European Union. It has to be said. I want to congratulate all stakeholders who have contributed to Jamaica's steady success in this area. The respective governments for creating an enabling environment for journalists to work freely, safely, and independently. Journalists and media workers for their commitment to keeping the population accurately informed, and to civil society for demanding accountability. I encourage the Press Association of Jamaica and indeed all Jamaicans to guard the gains made in press freedom carefully by insisting on a high standard of professionalism and responsible journalism to ensure that there is no regression. Jamaica and the European Union share a strong partnership built on shared values. Together, we have worked to address many of the older and newer related free press challenges. And I can assure you that the European Union reaffirms its commitment to continue to do so. Nothing left than wishing you a very interesting roundtable tonight, to congratulate the PAJ for the excellent initiative to organize this public forum, and of course also the journalists who by the end of the week will, I mean some of them will receive an award for their excellent work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Now, let me warn you, I hope that you are sharing those ideas with the hope that we'd pick it up, because I was making notes and I have those notes. One of the things that we love about the Press Association of Jamaica Public Forum is the way it brings so many people together, different age groups, different categories of persons, different professionals. So I would welcome at this time as well, Professor Trevor Monroe is with us in the Zoom, the head of National Integrity Action, the anti-corruption watchdog group with whom we share quite a few ideas and principles. Also like to welcome the president of the University of the West Indies Guild of Students, Sir J. Boswell, who is also with us. And I'm seeing also representation from Mona Law, that's the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies, lecturers and tutors from the faculty also in the room with us. Thank you all so very much. Okay, time for discussion now. So here are the ground rules. All the presenters, each presenter I should say, will have a maximum of 15 minutes to make their initial presentation. I'll indicate to the speaker when they have 5 minutes left, 2 minutes, and when time is up. At the end of all the presentations, then we'll open up for question and answer. If you're in the Zoom, we invite you to use the raise hand feature. If you're watching on YouTube, you can type your questions or comments in the chat. We're going to be monitoring that as well. Our first presenter, Damion Mitchell, Integration Editor at the Gleaner.
Madam Chair, walk with me back to the year 2015. That was the first time since the Global Press Freedom Assessment began for Jamaica in 2003 that the country was being ranked in the top 10. For the previous 12 years, of the 180 countries evaluated, our island was recording placements as low as 34th in 2005 and as high as 13th in 2013. Today, just months ahead of the release of the 2021 index, Jamaica is ranked 6th. But what was the turning point? And does Jamaica deserve its high press freedom ranking? Before we seek to explore these answers, may I pause to say thanks to President George and the Press Association of Jamaica for allowing me to be part of this August-January panel. And since controversy is expected with this topic, I would want to pronounce that the moderator had more than a hand in deciding the topic. But we'll live to fight again, DJ. We will live to fight again. And so here are some things to consider as we interrogate whether Jamaica deserves its high press freedom ranking. First up, what really does a free press look like? Then, can there be any assessment of Jamaica's high press freedom ranking without a reasonable comparison with other countries? And thirdly, in reality, are there state or other policies and our practices that seek to repress access to information of public interest? So while you think on these things, let me declare that yes, Jamaica does deserve its high press freedom ranking. Madam Chair, I do not speak on behalf of Reporters Without Borders, the global watchdog responsible for publishing the Press Freedom Index. However, I am familiar with at least one element that goes into the assignment of the rankings. That element is the administration of an annual survey, an evaluation tool that assesses the state provisions to facilitate a free, independent press. And this brings me then back to the first question. What really does a free press look like? For me, a free press is one which is not inhibited by the state apparatus through laws or uncodified practices. It is one where there is an absence of self-censorship by journalists, fearful of the potential consequences of interrogating matters that could expose realities adverse to their company executives, connected parties, or other power broker. A free press is one where there is a plurality of voices in an environment that encourages responsibility and fairness. It is one where public critique of media is okay, but public discrediting is not okay. Where there is transparency in the award of licenses for the operation of radio and television frequencies, and where what we watch, read, and listen are not paid for in a clandestine manner by the highest bidder. So, does Jamaica pass the test when we apply this rubric? I would say yes, but surely there is still work to be done. For I feel that there is still some level of self-censorship that exists among the local journalistic fraternity. But that, Madam Chair, pales in comparison to the bold energy that resides in so many newsrooms. And here I must point out that there are frequent calls for the use of that bold energy for more investigative journalism. That there is an unfulfilled appetite for investigative journalism does not mean Jamaica does not deserve its high press freedom ranking. In fact, in the Jamaican context, it is quite contradictory to link the press freedom ranking to infrequent examples of what is traditionally regarded as investigative journalism. Contradictory because, unlike Guyana, which only enacted its Access to Information Act in July 2013, Jamaica's ATI, as springboard for investigative journalism, was enacted in 2002. And in Jamaica, the Access to Information request may be sent to any government agency or ministry which has designated officers to handle these requests. In Guyana, all requests must go through the Commissioner of Information, an individual appointed by the President. As Anand Gulsaran of Accountability Watch puts it, this centralized model is the beginning of potential bottlenecks in the processing of the requested information in Guyana. Information which may only become available after its relevance for decision-making and other purposes is lost. And Guyana, by the way, is now ranked 49th on the Global Press Freedom Index. Its best ranking, 39th, 2009. Its worst, 88, 2008. No doubt, Madam Chair, there are other factors which would impact this history. In fact, Reporters Without Borders says, although Guyana's constitution guarantees free speech and the right to information, officials often use various pieces of legislation to silence opposition journalists. So, for example, the defamation laws, which provide for fines and up to 2 years in jail. And in Guyana, the members of the Media Regulatory Authority are appointed directly by the president. This restricts the freedom of certain media outlets, which are denied licenses. The media watchdog also said recent attempts to improve regulation of the broadcast industry involved no consultation with any broadcaster. Journalists in Guyana are still subjected to harassment that takes the form of prosecutions, suspensions, and intimidation. Permit me, though, Madam Chair, to go back to the issue of Guyana's Access to Information Act, because it does provide for any person aggrieved by a decision of the Information Commissioner to go to the High Court for a review. This is quite unlike Trinidad and Tobago, where recourse is to the Ombudsman in the first place, then to the High Court, and here in Jamaica, where an appeals tribunal hears cases of denial of access to information with no provision of recourse to the courts. But then Trinidad, ranked 35th on the Global Press Freedom Index, has its other problems. Only recently, Justice Frank C. Prasad ruled as unlawful and unconstitutional 2 warrants obtained by the Trinidadian police to search the Trinidad Express newspaper for information which could lead to a journalist's source. According to the judge, this was plainly irregular, as the warrants disproportionately infringed on the media house's right to freedom of the press. Well, Jamaica can boast that this has never been a reality, certainly in my generation, but still, we cannot be complacent given the provisions of the Data Protection Act passed into law last year. Essentially, the access any information requested by the proposed Information Commissioner must be handed over. The Media Association Jamaica has contended, for example, that this could remove the journalists or media houses' ability to protect the identity of sources. Then there's also the concern that a description of the personal data being processed is to be registered before being published. Well, there's another reason Jamaica should be vigilant to maintain its press freedom ranking. This was Prime Minister Andrew Holness on a political platform in Tivoli Gardens, Kingston Western in November 2009, as reported by the Jamaica Observer's Arthur Hall. Quote, "I was just listening to the news before I came here, and you know, the news report is the news report. I make no comment on the opinions proffered by journalists because that is the freedom of the society. They can take whatever stance they want to take because it's free media. It doesn't have to be the truth. It doesn't have to relate to the facts. It is their opinion. What you have to understand as persons consuming the news is that not all the things that are presented to you are the facts or are the truth. You can go on social media. You can go on my page, all my social media pages, the party pages. You have so much news opportunities to keep informed. You don't have to rely on one particular medium for information, commentary, or opinion." End quote. Let's replay. "I make no comment on the opinions proffered by journalists because that is freedom of the society," said the Prime Minister. "They can take whatever stance they want to take because it's free media." And then this, "It doesn't have to be the truth. It doesn't have to relate to the facts. It's their opinion." That's the Prime Minister of Jamaica's assessment of the news in his country. Well, I call it an unfortunate unload that is often a precursor to public discrediting. And so the media must be vigilant. The media must be very vigilant, Madam Chair. That aside, there have been positive developments in the past decade which support my position that Jamaica deserves its high press freedom ranking. So we've seen the removal of criminal libel from the books in 2013, the addition of radio stations and the expansion of community newspapers, the strengthening of media entities through mergers and acquisitions, though this is more and more threatening the plurality of news sources. And we have seen increased access to internet, a critical tool for communication and research for the modern journalist. In the United States, ranked 45th in 2020, 45th, what a coincidence. There's also widespread access to the internet, but public denigration and the harassment of journalists continued. So there are reasons to celebrate Jamaica's realities in relation to press freedom, for our country is indeed a leader. But as former JTA President Paul Adams once said, leaders must be made to lead. Leaders must be made to perform, and those who refuse to perform must be made to leave.
Thank you so much, Damion. Okay, well, starting us off there with whole heap of food for thought. And I see a question in the YouTube already. Excellent question. Just keep typing them in. We'll come and we'll try and answer as many of them as possible when we start the Q&A, but just getting through all the presentations first. So let me invite our next presenter, Marilyn Facey from the University of Technology, Jamaica. She is one of the program directors and lecturers.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. In examining 2020 and the question at hand, in looking at the events and its impact on press freedom and the rankings, the following quote came to mind as I prepared this presentation. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light. It was a season of darkness. In short, The period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on it being received for good or evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. My presentation today I've titled Ranked, stories from 3 countries. And these stories that I want to look at are taken from Jamaica, Canada, and Guyana. Interesting dealing with our choices. I recognize some similarities in our comments. So Jamaica is ranked 6th, Canada 16th, and Guyana 49. Now, in making these, this choice of where to present, or who to present on, I looked at not only their ranks, but also the fact that all 3 rose 2 points from their 2019-2020 Press Freedom Index. And also I took the position of looking at 3 criteria in the Press Freedom Index as well, which determines the rank of each country. So the opening sentence from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, I thought was apt, given the setting of the novel before the French Revolution and after as well. And while I'm taking some liberties here, looking at the year 2020, there were elections in 2 of the 3 countries highlighted, election in a third, which I'll also highlight, though not the focus. And also looking at the conditions in the country. So in Jamaica, for example, we experienced a pandemic. We operated through a pandemic. We're still in the midst of a pandemic. General elections, accusations of fake news, challenges to incorrect or incomplete stories being reported, especially on social media, that was very loud and often stated. Scathing criticisms. However, this was also paired with frequent press briefings, especially in the early parts of the pandemic, robust leadership debate, probing interviews. I must note quality election night coverage, but that's just a little plug. We also saw open political endorsements, access to information, and here in particular, reports on corruption or mismanagement of funds. I want to note the work by the Auditor General. I think that is commendable. We also saw brilliant investigative pieces and an increase in human interest stories, which I actually loved in television. Truly, it could be described as, despite the situation being somewhat the worst of times, the ability of media and the press in Jamaica to rise above despite the challenges, utilize the resources, though limited, and still perform and attain its rank as commendable. So within the worst, we gave of our best, I consider. As such, in considering the discussion, the question for discussion, does Jamaica deserve its high press freedom ranking given the limited time allotted? I took a very specific approach, very brief look at these 3 countries, 3 specific criteria, and 3 examples relating to press freedom, while drawing on examples influenced by the political climate, general elections specifically, and the politics of the day in general. So Reporters Without Borders lists the criteria that aids in the ranking of the countries on the World Press Freedom Index as the following: pluralism, representation of opinions in the media space, media independence, self-censorship, legislative framework, transparency, infrastructure, abuses, and violence. I will focus on the following: pluralism, or the representation of different opinions, different voices in the media space, abuses, violence, and media independence. The 2020 index suggests that the next 10 years will be pivotal for press freedom because of the covering crises affecting the future of journalism: geopolitical crises, technological crises, democratic crises, crises of trust, and economic crises. In its main findings, the index made specific mention of the situation in the United States in 2020, though not one of the countries I will go in depth with. I thought its rank at 45, worth mentioning, and the report stated, as it relates to democratic crisis, quote, The crisis caused by growing hostility and even hatred towards journalists. And this crisis has now worsened. It has resulted in more serious and frequent acts of physical violence, and therefore an unprecedented level of fear in some countries. Leading politicians and those close to them continue to openly foment hatred of journalists. President Donald Trump's, the title remains though. So President Donald Trump, his treatment, his statements relating to the media and his encouragement of, let's just use the word hatred as described by the index, was cited specifically by Reporters Without Borders. The situation in the US presented a clear example of the types of abuses and threats that journalists face today. In the US, journalists covering protests were deliberately shot at with rubber bullets by police, arrested, and blocked from covering or reporting, while many others were physically abused by protesters or party supporters. While in Jamaica, we have, and especially when the political climate is high, we have incidents of threats. We have statements made on the platform that incites the supporters towards acts of violence towards journalists, while we do have journalists who are fearful of covering certain events, especially, as I said, I'm framing this within the political climate. We do not have the situation as described in the US, and I think we are deserving of a ranking for that. Now, the Reporters Without Borders, RSF, it described Jamaica as among the countries that most respect press freedom and freedom of information, as the moderator stated. It, however, made a note that the Data Protection Act in 2018 and the 2019 Criminal Justice and Administration Act, the legislation passed, created a sharp increase in the fines for photographs taken outside of court from $20 to $1 million. And as mentioned earlier, economic threats, economic impact is also a challenge to freedom of the press. This is viewed as a retrograde step at the time when greater access to information should be promoted and not penalized. It also noted that there was concern this past year about the Prime Minister's claim that media is not required to report facts, as Damion stated, which sought to undermine the press. However, in terms of pluralism or representation of opinions, which is what I want to focus my comments on Jamaica on, in 2020, however, we witnessed, first time in my lifetime, or my awareness of media, let's say 18 plus, we witnessed the public endorsement of then PNP party presidential candidate Mark Golding by RGR Gleaner Group chair Joseph Matalan. This move was met with immediate criticism, but also with probing questions from members of his own group. It also saw the expression of public support by Prime Minister Andrew Holness led administration in the management of COVID-19. I raise this point to say that in Jamaica, not only is there the ability to express your view and to express differing views, but I found it intriguing that even the press would criticize and then, would raise concerns and then criticize itself. We also saw that example as well when Apka Fitz-Henley raised the concern about a question that was asked as it relates to the relationship status of a certain elected representative during a press briefing, calling it inappropriate. And he rightfully had the ability to raise those concerns in the media and have that covered as well. So we are not only critical of government officials, we're critical of ourselves as media practitioners. Now, Canada, in terms of notes, best and worst as well, the RSF said that it demonstrated commitment to global press freedom. Two extremes I will note here. One is the creation of the Media Freedom Coalition, which was mentioned, which is noted between the UK and Canada. I also saw reports where there are panels of expert legal minds that are seeking to ensure the safe refuge for journalists at risk, calling for visa-free access and so on. So I see that there are steps being taken as it relates to that in terms of press freedom. However, there are still concerns raised as it relates to barriers to access, where we saw reporters who were covering indigenous issues related to indigenous peoples were barred from going to perform their duties, arrests as well. I have 5 minutes, so that's why I'm rushing through. The final country that I wanted to raise is Guyana. And in Guyana, I wanted to look at the issue of media independence. And this is a very interesting country. So despite the recent awards of several licenses, and despite a bit of opening up of the press, if you examine the situation in Guyana, where, for example, the National Communication Network, NCN, is the largest broadcaster, it has 8 community radio stations, 3 online, and 10 free-to-air television, where the state is the largest advertiser. The government is the largest source of revenue. You see situations where even Starbright News publicly complained about certain advertising practices, which was used as a means of starving them into falling in line. Then you see that the situation of the economic situation also impacts the level of freedom. So I wanted to just close with this question as it relates to media independence. So once a country is heavily dependent on state subvention, then the government of the day will always have undue influence. Can there be a discussion about democracy and freedom without an acknowledgement of the role of the media or of the press in this situation? Now, despite the economic situation in Jamaica, we are still not so heavily reliant upon state advertising, etc., to make it a question when we report something, whether or not we will lose our license or whether or not we will starve for the period, etc. So I just wanted to say that 2020 was an interesting year. So I got 2 minutes magically. 2020 was an interesting year. And many people, when they look at threats to press freedoms that are highlighted in other countries, these aren't things that often occur in Jamaica. And when they do occur, we have the ability to fight, write, state, and disagree. We also have a robust Press Association of Jamaica, I must commend. As soon as something happens that is outside of the remit, they will write and fight for journalists, and that is also encouraged. So the index, it ranks the countries as it relates to journalists. It is not, however, an indicator of the quality of journalism in each country or region. And that is a quote from RSF. And that is another thing. When persons say we do not deserve the high press ranking that we have, that is often the argument that is made. The quality of reporting, that is not what the index is measuring. It is measuring whether or not in these 3 instances there are sufficient channels for views to be aired. There is sufficient variety of the views. If there are opposing views, can they contend? And if you have challenges, do you have avenues available to raise those, especially persons who are on social media? Even the fact that we are here today debating this issue, I think, speaks to the freedom that Jamaica rightly enjoys. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Marilyn. So we're going to have now Dennis Brooks. He is, as I said, presenting by Zoom. So Damion, so Dennis, I beg your pardon. I'm not going to be able to slip you bits of paper with your time left on it. So I'm going to ask you to monitor yourself so that you can come to a natural end and I won't have to interrupt you on Zoom. So Dennis now is Senior Communication Strategist at the Jamaica Constabulary Force, and I turn you over to him.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to my fellow participants and to the various dignitaries who are present today. I also very much thank you for the opportunity to join in on this conversation.
Hold on. We're just sorting out the technicals. We'll go to Dennis in just a moment. Just to remind you that after the presentations, and we expect the usual robust question and answer session, and we look forward to that. Go ahead, Dennis. Go ahead, Dennis. Go ahead. As possible. Let me just remind you, our hashtags for the evening are PAJ Forum 2021 and also Press Freedom JA. So as we sort out Dennis's presentation, just to remind you, I'll be the presenter after that. And don't worry, I will also be monitoring my time, although I'm sure that Damion will be happy to slip me bits of paper as well in terms of the timing. Press Freedom Day, World Press Freedom Day, celebrated every year on May 2. So it's around that time that we will be getting the 2021 press rankings. Dennis?
Hi.
Thank you.
All right, I'm getting a significant feedback. I'm not sure if you're hearing me clearly. Hello? Good evening, everyone. Are you hearing me clearly? Is there still a feedback? All right, I'm going to hope that that has been sorted out. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, to my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much to you all for the opportunity to join in on this conversation. I will try not to repeat the things that have been said thus far. So I acknowledge the current ranking of 6th that we have, and I take note of the statistics that have been presented thus far. Again, I won't repeat them because I'll take them as established, that we have this enviable position in the ranking over the years. And I agree with you, Dionne Jackson-Miller, that every time that this comes out, the question arises of whether or not we are deserving of our enviable rankings since we've moved up. And so my approach is not necessarily a comparative analysis of other rankings, but to deconstruct the question. Why do we keep asking this question, or who keeps asking this question? Are we asking whether for some reason Jamaica deserves its ranking, or are we questioning whether or not any country on the list deserves its ranking? Because if you are of the view that Jamaica has a ranking that it does not deserve, then why not question the USA's ranking, or Barbados, or Mexico, or Nicaragua, or any other country for that matter? And so I often, when people question whether or not we deserve our ranking, my question is, are we questioning Jamaica's performance, or are we questioning the index itself? So my position is that in spite of the challenges and the limitations, the ranking system is sound, and Jamaica's position in that ranking system is merited. So why question the rankings? The index has emerged as a crucial tool, not just for general public consumption and debate, but also for donors, for implementers, for academics, in their attempts to understand relationships among media assistants. It is a crucial tool in studying democracy and the evolution of democracy and democratic performance and auditing and other aspects of human development. So in view of the breadth and depth of their impact, for me, academics have been studying the quality of the social science that underlies these types of studies for some time. And when we question, oh, does a country deserve its ranking? Many times we're looking at the methodology used, the issues of cultural neutrality, and Reporters Without Borders and even Freedom House's focus on old media. So let me touch a couple of those. First, the methodological concerns of reliability and validity. So what does the ranking really measure? Is it content valid? Does it consistently measure what it sets out to measure? So that's more an issue of reliability, not necessarily validity. And there have been criticisms about inconsistencies in the questionnaires and whether or not press freedom is really properly defined and operationalized such that we are truly able to measure, and then once we measure, able to compare between countries. And there is often the suggestion that many of the researchers themselves have become professionally blinkered with their values that they are seeking to gauge. The issue of Western bias is something that has been raised, and in this discussion, I would encourage us to take that issue on, because the African Media Barometer, for instance, was devised to measure media conditions specifically in the developing nations of Africa, because there is the suggestion that possibly Reporters Without Borders and Freedom House might not be accurately representing the development of press freedom in those countries. UNESCO has devised its new media development indicators, and that it calls them culturally and politically neutral. And the indicators are applied only with the cooperation of the country's government and the participation of commercial and civil society groups, etc. But they even, because of that methodology, aren't able to produce numerical scores and rank country by country. And I still think there is value in producing numerical scores and ranking country by country, because if not, then why do we have a whole field called comparative politics where we rank country by country? Also, there is the criticism of bias towards traditional media. And so many of the questions, some analysts feel the main problem with the existing surveys and the methodologies, a perceived focus on old media, such as newspapers, radio, and television. And they feel that as the internet continues to expand and billions of people move to mobile technologies, that the new indicators are needed to accurately measure digital media's impact on press freedom and how countries are embracing that. I still believe, in spite of all of that, that yes, Jamaica deserves its ranking, and that the rankings themselves have merit, they have efficacy, that they measure something that we should be paying attention to. Again, I would also look at what goes into the ranking. It has been established. I won't go over that too much, but when we look at violence against journalists, is a big variable to consider. And in Jamaica, over the years, there's not been violence against journalists, particularly because they are journalists. We have seen threats, and those threats, for the most part, have not been carried out. Also, actual government constraints on media. Those are two important variables that would be used to determine a country's ranking. And there are some people who say that there need to be better variables to consider, because things like these are better variables that apply to non-democratic societies or societies with weak democracies. And I am of the view that Jamaica has an enviable tradition in democracy. Our democratic institutions are sound. There have been, in spite of challenges, smooth transitions of power from administration to administration, even during the period of violence and the ideological divide of the Cold War and our flirtations with all different kinds of democratic socialism versus capitalism versus you name it. And there are persons who are of the view that we need a more nuanced approach. So yes, as it has been said, we should place a greater premium on the ownership structure of media. And for instance, in Jamaica, where because of economic challenges, we see mergers and acquisitions and media conglomerates developing, high concentrations of power into the hands of a few. Also, media's dependence on advertising and where that advertising dollar is going to come from and the extent to which they are free to speak because of their, whether or not they may be wedded to a particular advertiser. That ties in with the challenge of funding a modern newsroom. And when we often think about the challenges that many journalists face, whether or not they're just taking stories off a wire, whether or not they're just taking press releases, or whether or not they're able to aggressively go out and pursue stories. And many times the challenge is that newsrooms in Jamaica are poorly funded. So some persons may argue that because of that, that there is a limitation to the quality of our press freedom. This issue of self-censorship has been raised, and the issue of legislative limitations like defamation legislation. I myself have been sued back in 2009, was it, for pursuing what I felt was a legitimate story, and there ended the story once it became sub judice. And some people would say that is a limitation. Also, the facilitation of citizen voices. And I think this is one area where Jamaica is exceptional in being able to pull citizen voices, that it's not just the same talking heads, whether it's the call-in show culture from the Public Eye days and John Maxwell days till now, Mutty Perkins, Cliff Hughes, you name it, or whether or not we should be looking at threats to the plurality of media in Jamaica, or just the inefficiency of government bureaucracy and to what extent that holds us back. I'm approaching 10 minutes. I'm going to try to be quick. So when we look at some of the criticisms of local media, I always put them into a context of small island developing states and the challenge of media freedom. Because unlike the United States of America, massive country, massive democracy, you have a small island state where everybody's interconnected somehow by old school ties or communities where you're from. Everybody knows who you are, everybody knows where you come from, etc. That very often it is difficult to just write and be truly free just by virtue of size, and size matters in this context. Also, the question of the oversight of the press and the protection from the press. Who is holding the Jamaican media to account in a similar way as maybe the General Legal Counsel you can go to if you have a challenge with an attorney, etc. And the argument was raised by my two colleagues about the Prime Minister chiding the media. And it is just universally taken as an argument that he scolded the media. But the truth is that he was speaking about inaccuracy without correction or inaccuracy without apology. And you were saying that there is now, given the explosion of social media, a plethora of other sources from which you can acquire the news, which we all know to be true. And that is a good segue to my argument that says it is my view that the measurements, though not perfect, they measure something. And they have measured that something reliably for a long time. It is also my view that while Freedom House and Reporters Without Borders have tweaked their methodology over the years, Jamaica's reputation has remained intact. We've seen in previous decades an explosion of media, whether Jamaican radio stations and Jamaican newspapers. Some have risen, some have fallen, some have come together. Jamaican free-to-air and cable television stations, explosion. There was an explosion of magazines at one point, and those have evolved into the digital. All of these have added to the plurality of the Jamaican media landscape and our ability as a free press to hold power to account. And in this regard, I think it is beyond question that Jamaica deserves its ranking. When I look at Jamaica's embrace of not just free press, but a free social media, there has been an explosion of new podcasts in Jamaica, or just persons who acquire a massive social media following, and government and other mainstream stakeholders embrace them. We saw during COVID, Dr. Christopher Tufton, the health minister, joining Spices Live and this person's live on Instagram. Why? Because of an acknowledgement of the power of the platform that these individuals, not just media houses, but individuals hold. And so we see the explosion of broadcasters now. And so much of what emanates from social media is what drives the news cycle now. So Twitter is now where the news breaks. And so media houses have had to pivot to social media engagement to increase their social media engagement in order to stay relevant, which then validates the role of social media. So for me, minute and a half left, what does our ranking mean? The ranking for me is an indicator of where we are in the pursuit of developmental goals and objectives. So yes, we are in the company of many countries that are far more advanced than us economically. But when we look at when we look at media freedom is both a democratic input as well as a democratic outcome. It is both a developmental input and a developmental outcome. So while we are not the wealthiest of nations in terms of economic development, there are many areas of human development like education, healthcare, sports, and sports development in which Jamaica outstrips many developed nations. And nobody questions our performance or deservedness in our ranking in those areas. So I don't question the quality of Jamaica's journalistic tradition and freedom and the environment within which we practice, and the various factors that contribute to our ranking. There are legislative policy decisions, whether ATI legislation, removal of criminal libel, etc., that are directly correlated with a rise or a fall in our ranking. And in that regard, it is justified, it is equitable, it is fair. And press association presidents can say, during my tenure when I was leading the journalistic community, we rose or we improved or we did this or we did that, because there are equitable measures of measuring. That's my contribution to the conversation thus far. I will stop at 15:23 so that other people can ask questions and participate. Thank you for listening.
Wow, Dennis. Could not have asked for more. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm switching hats now, guys. So I'll be, as I mentioned, doing a presentation as well. I wanted to look at some of the legal and constitutional issues in relation to freedom of the press. So I'm a tweeter. So I put out on Twitter that we're going to be having this forum looking at Jamaica's freedom of the press ranking. And immediately, what came back at me, well, you'll see what came back at me in just a little while, which was a tweet from Gordon Robinson saying, "Dead with laugh, Jamaica has no press freedom." So I answered him, as I do. Turning it on might help you think. Okay, there you go. There's always a technical answer to these very important technical questions. Okay. So Gordon answered me and said that Dead with laugh, Jamaica has no press freedom. So I answered him and said, "Don't agree with you, Gordon, but come talk to me now. We'd love to hear from you." I don't know what it would take to get Gordon onto Zoom, so that's not happening. But he did answer back, and then his response was this: there are no degrees of press freedom. Either you have it or you don't. Freedom that can't be enforced isn't freedom, it's illusion. It bends to political whim. So the USA has press freedom, he said. Trinidad and Tobago has press freedom. Jamaica has none. Now, given that we don't know any Jamaican journalists in places that look like this, what does Gordon mean? Now, I'm not going to try to get into the head of my learned friend, but I can say to you that he has repeatedly expressed concern about the fact that Jamaica does not have a constitutional provision for the right of freedom of the press. Now, you've heard this mentioned, like I skipped one. Yes, just by way of context, this is one definition of who is a journalist. A person whose main occupation is to contribute directly, either regularly or occasionally for consideration to the collection, writing, or production of information for dissemination by the media or anyone who helps someone like that. Because whenever you have these conversations, who is a journalist? You know, if I'm on the bus tweeting for 5 minutes a day, does that make me a journalist? Well, according to this definition, no. Maybe by another definition. Now, both Marilyn and Damion made mention of the Press Freedom Index survey, and I'm one of the people who answers that survey every year in Jamaica. It's a long survey, 70-something pages. And let me just take you through a couple more of the questions very quickly so you understand what we mean when we say the Press Freedom Index relates to structural and systemic issues. And some of these are questions that wouldn't even come to your mind in Jamaica because we take them for granted. Does the government put roadblocks in the way of the development of media? Does the government stop media from reporting? Can citizens, can somebody just call up RGR and say, I want to talk to Jamaica, to Dionne, I beg your pardon, or call Sportsmax and want to talk to George without the government sending a policeman or listening in? Well, they may listen in, who knows? Do private media exist? Is government advertising distributed equitably? And this is a problem they've had elsewhere in the Caribbean, especially in very small societies. Government advertising is very important. And if the government doesn't like what you're carrying and pulls advertising, a media house can in fact go out of business as a result of that. Can ethnic and religious minorities enter media? Is professional journalism training available? Can journalists cover events in person? Do media professionals have the freedom to join unions? Is investigative journalism developed enough to cover matters of significance? Do media reflect opinions among the public? And I'm sure these are just a few of the questions. You can look at them and you're going there, duh, yeah, duh. Well, that's one of the reasons we have such a high press freedom ranking. In relation to the subject of this presentation, though, access to information laws, yes, we do, but is press freedom guaranteed in the Constitution? Back to the concern that my friend Gordon raises a lot. No, it's not. Are journalistic sources protected by law? No, they're not. So what does the Jamaican Constitution say? As I mentioned, it does not have a section that says you have the right to freedom of the press. What it says is that we have the right to freedom of expression. We also have the right to seek, receive, distribute, or disseminate information, opinions, and ideas through any media. That sounds nice and broad. So if we have that in our Constitution, why are we still beating up our chests and talking about freedom of the press? Does it matter? Gordon mentioned both Trinidad and Tobago and the United States. In Trinidad, the Constitution provides for freedom of thought and expression. There is also separately delineated a right to freedom of the press. And in the United States as well, the First Amendment to their Constitution says that Congress shall make no law which abridges freedom of speech or of the press. So again, you have the two rights separately delineated. And there are a number of questions that arise. So the Jamaican Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, as legislation it's still a relatively new law. It was just passed in 2011. Why would we not have enshrined freedom of the press in our Constitution? Also, if freedom of expression and freedom of the press mean the same thing, why is it that some jurisdictions, such as Trinidad and Tobago and the US, why do they think it's important to have a separate provision of freedom of the press? And does it matter? Well, I can tell you that the non-inclusion of freedom of the press in the Jamaican Charter wasn't for want of lobbying. The Press Association and the Media Association did lobby very, very strongly. The parliamentarians were insistent that it was not necessary. Now, this is a little wordy, but bear with me. There are some things I don't like to paraphrase, right? Now, the Supreme Court in the Tomlinson case, which was a freedom of expression case, quoted from the 1994 report of the Constitutional Commission, which made recommendations for the reform of the Jamaican Constitution. And the Commission said this: while recognizing the critical role played by the press in preservation of democracy, by a majority decision, we did not accept that the only or even the most effective way of providing the appropriate constitutional guarantee is by the use of the term freedom of the press. They went on to say, press literally means a printing house or a newspaper establishment. Modern technology has demonstrated that there's unlimited scope for development of methods of expression and communication. It therefore requires a particularly liberal extension of the word press to cover all these new developments. Accordingly, we have preferred the use of the word media. Now, I am baffled at this. I am baffled as to why in 1994 the Constitutional Commission would think that they should take it upon themselves to reinvent or reinterpret the meaning of the word press, a word which for decades has been accepted as meaning not just a printing press or newspaper establishment, but the entire journalistic core. In addition, in law, when you use the same phrases, it's because you want to mean the same thing. When you use freedom of the press, that has been interpreted in law over and over and over. When you start to talk about dissemination through any media, you're going to get into a situation now where there is in fact a conversation or an argument as to, does this actually mean freedom of the press? Is it the same thing? And does it carry the same guarantees and the same protections? And to answer that, let me go back to the PowerPoint presentation if I could, because I want to go a little bit more into the case that Damion mentioned that just came out of Trinidad. Really nice case. I love this case. You should actually find it and read it. Really nice. So here's what happened. In March last year, on March 8th, the Trinidad Express carried this story. Assistant Commissioner of Police flagged for suspicious activity. Bank records deposits of close to 2 million into over 15 personal accounts. Try to imagine the bacchanal in Trinidad when a story like this broke, all right? 2 days' time, a follow-up story. Cops under PCA probed 2 million deposited into bank accounts. Big excitement. Who is leaking this information? So the very next day, what happens? A police raid on the headquarters of the Trinidad Express. They carry with them warrants authorizing seizure of items for evidence of tipping off, meaning leaking information. And these items that they seized included 4 jump drives. They were actually trying to get into the server of the Express, and they tell them, look, the person who deals with that is not here, and if you interfere with the server, the entire thing is going to shut down. So they left. When the police officer, who was the subject of the article, was contacted for comment, he said this: well, if you want to print whatever you want, Derry, you can, but just be mindful that there are repercussions. Now, the court was concerned about this because if a journalist is asking a senior police officer for comment and the response is there are repercussions, you can imagine the concerns about intimidation and so on. That's not why I'm sharing it though. I'm sharing it because I'm appalled. That expression, that's me, that in 2020 and 2021, men still feel that they must use words like this when they're talking to professional women, right? Dearie, sweetheart, darling. Anytime a woman is asking questions they don't like, a journalist, many women journalists can tell you about conversations like this. And I'm raising it to say you all should have that expression on your face. And those of you who may still be using this kind of language, stop it. And call out people when they do. Call out men when they do. Forgive my digressing. That's one of my that's one of my pet peeves. All right. So the court now in the Trinidad case made reference to a 1990 comment by the court in another freedom of the press case. And look at what the court said. The court said, freedom of the press includes freedom of thought and expression and vice versa. But where each freedom is set out separately, as in the case in Section 4 of the Trinidadian Constitution, freedom of the press must have a greater and more all-encompassing meaning than freedom of thought and expression. So the court is saying they're not the same thing. When you have them listed separately, freedom of the press means more. The court also spoke about journalist sources and said disclosure of a journalist source needs to be treated with caution. Information is a journalist's currency. Source protection is an integral and constituent component of press freedom. The court is able to look at the issue of of sources of a journalist within the context of press freedom because they have a constitutional right to freedom of the press. If we in Jamaica sought to resist disclosure of a journalist's sources and we try to rely on freedom of expression as a constitutional right, would we be successful? Would we get anywhere? I have serious doubts that we could. The court also said no one is above the law, including the media. However, the vital and necessary role engaged by the media does require that the right to press freedom must be treated as one which carries special importance. Again, it's not the same. Freedom of the press imbues very special protection upon the media. And the court also spoke about the issue of search warrants. Effecting a search warrant upon a media house cannot be equated to a situation where a search warrant is executed on a private citizen. Given that any unjustified interference with press freedom can have a retrograde, reverberating, and recessive impact upon society as a whole. Again, folks, they're not the same. Freedom of the press is not the same thing as freedom of expression, and that is because of the important role that the press plays in a democratic society. It is for that reason that the press deserves special constitutional protection. The court also spoke about the importance of the newspaper articles. They made the public aware of this investigation that would allow the public to, force the government, force the authorities to ensure that the investigation was properly carried out. And of course, it was a matter of significant public interest. The court also recommended legislative protection for journalist sources, similar to the Canadian Journalistic Sources Protection Act of 2017. Now let's put all of this in perspective. The fact that the USA and Trinidad and Tobago have these constitutional protections that Jamaica doesn't have doesn't mean that they're leaps and bounds ahead of us in terms of press freedom overall. As you've heard by now a million times, Jamaica ranked 6th last year, Trinidad and Tobago 36, and the United States 45. That's because it's one of the issues that's looked at. However, I'm a firm believer that systems have to be as robust as possible. Laws have to be as strong as possible. We cannot assume, which I find we tend to in Jamaica, that government will always be friendly to the press. We cannot assume that the occupant of Jamaica House, that the Commissioner of Police, that the Chief of Defense Staff will always assume a friendly attitude towards the press. And if the past 4 years have taught us nothing, they should have taught us how quickly the unthinkable can be normalized, and also how quickly hostility can grow and develop towards the press. Just an example, in 2018, you may remember this, there was an altercation at the White House press briefing, and the White House, as a consequence, took away the press credentials of CNN reporter Jim Acosta. Now, CNN immediately sued, claiming a violation of the First Amendment rights, that's freedom of the press. A restraining order was granted, the White House backed down, so this matter was never adjudicated upon. The point, though, is that CNN had, as one of their primary arrows in their quiver, the constitutional protection of freedom of the press. It makes a difference. The Guardian had reported, in fact, that in 1977, a White House reporter had been banned. 11 years later, the DC Court of Appeal actually ruled in favor of the reporter, saying constitution of a press pass violates the First Amendment unless it furthers a compelling government interest. So my recommendations coming out of all of that are, in fact, that I do believe this ongoing conversation about constitutional reform in Jamaica, the next time around we're making amendments to the Constitution and the Charter, we must include the right of freedom of the press, and also that we do need to enact legislation to protect journalist sources. And that is where I now switch hats back. And we'll be going now to the question and answer section. So I want to thank you all so much. As I bring up my laptop, we'll be taking questions from you as Zoom, as well as in the chat. So I invite you to use the raise hand feature in the Zoom if you wish to participate, and as well to go to us on the chat as well. There had been a question in the YouTube that I had wanted to go to as soon as I could. Here it is. Jermaine was asking, what freedom does a Jamaican journalist have that his or her counterparts in the US and the UK don't? Two of the countries rank lower than Jamaica on the Press Freedom Index. And Damion, I'm going to hand that one over to you. What freedom does a Jamaican journalist have that his or her counterparts in the US and the UK don't have? Those two countries chosen because they both rank lower than Jamaica on the Press Freedom Index.
Are we on? Good. So it's very important for us to go back to the survey, the issue of the survey, which is what is behind Reporters Without Borders' decision to assign ranking. Now, very, very critical is the systems that are in place for journalists to operate freely. And to a great extent, if we should be going by the rubric, it is felt that in the Jamaican context, there are more circumstances which make for a reporter, a journalist, practicing journalist, to effectively and efficiently carry out his or her function as compared with what exists in the UK or the US. I could not cite specific examples without doing adequate research on it, but certainly I would imagine that the survey would take into account all the areas and situations which would have happened to have allowed them to arrive at that panel ranking.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
I don't think it can be answered as straightforward as Jamaica has certain freedoms that the UK or the US doesn't have. I don't think that's the situation. I think when you consider how ranks are established, it's going to be that you have received points based on the systems or mechanisms that are in place in one country versus the other, and the exercising or the ability or the things that threaten those. And I think that is where the difference lies. So it's not, so for example, we don't have freedom of the press, we have freedom of expression, and it's not that we have we have fewer media houses when compared to the US. It's not anything like that. So it's not a comparison of plurality or access or so on. It is that when these are expressed, do the mechanisms that exist aid or inhibit? Is it that journalists are free without whatever may accompany it, whether it's fear or violence or threat of, loss of something? Is it more? It's that comparison that is what would give you the points as it relates to affecting your rank. So it's not the absence, it's the ability to practice freely.
All right, thank you so much, Marilyn. Again, just want to remind our participants in the Zoom to use the raise hand feature or to type your question or your comment into the chat and I'll go to you. All right, so here's a question. And Dennis, of course, please feel free to indicate when you want to jump in and respond as well, because a lot of the questions are general questions. All right, so Shamir is asking, on YouTube, since we don't have protections for sources, what are the implications if a source is called to be present to defend the origins of information presented? Okay, let me answer that question if I could in two ways. First of all, let me just tell you a little bit more about the Canadian legislation. Now, what the Canadian Journalistic Sources Protection Act does is it actually amends the Evidence Act. So it allows journalists to refuse to disclose information or to refuse to give up any documents that would identify their source unless the document can't be obtained by any other reasonable means. And the court, if the matter could then be subject to a court hearing, the court is obliged under the law to take a number of factors into consideration. The court would have to look at whether or not the information can be produced in evidence by any other reasonable means. Also, whether the public interest in the administration of justice, meaning the revelation of the source, outweighs the public interest in preserving confidentiality of the source. Another factor, the importance of the information to those proceedings, also importantly, the court would have to look at the issue of freedom of the press and the impact of disclosure on the source and on the journalist. And there's that public interest test would be very important. Is it in the public interest for the source to be disclosed, or is it in the public interest? And the public interest there would include democracy and protecting freedom of the press for the source not to be disclosed. So that's by way of background. So you're saying what would be the implications if a source is called to be present? You would have a number of steps there, because first of all, as was done in Trinidad and Tobago, the authorities would then have to seek to try to force the reporter to give up that information if it were, for instance, here in Jamaica. The point is, we don't have any law that would protect us if we say we are not giving up that information. And there have been situations in other countries where reporters have gone to jail for contempt of court, for refusing to name a source. So that actually would be one clear danger of that kind of situation, because the court would not be empowered to take into account the kind of factors that they are allowed to take into account in Canada. So the first hurdle would be, is the journalist going to give up his or her source or not? The tradition in journalism is that you protect your source. Go ahead, Damion.
Is there any relevance for the whistleblower law that we have in this country?
There's none. When you look at the whistleblower laws, because I know a lot of people are like, yay, kind of thing. I'm actually want to do a study on how often that has been used. I don't think it's ever been used when you look at the structure of the law. But separate from that, the people to whom you are allowed to disclose information and claim protection under the Whistleblowers Act don't include media. So you have the DPP, you have a range of people who are listed in the law to whom public servants would be able to go and blow the whistle, disclose information that I think is in the public interest and that the public needs to know, that, but media is not included. So if a public servant comes to one of us and says, all right, money thieving in this particular ministry, here are some documents, you need to know this, and it comes to light, there's no protection there under the Whistleblowers Act. Marilyn, you wanted to say something on that?
Similar to the situation with the Canadian legislation, it is that the other steps would have had to be fulfilled. So in that instance, was the report made to the OCG or to the Auditor General or something of that sort would be the considerations. Hence, I think where the law is taking that into account, why journalists would not have been one of those protected, because there were other agencies that report could have been made to, that could have then led to an investigation. The thought that was in my head that you saw was actually, would the, she did see it.
We used to work together
for quite a few years. So the thought was it would probably be the journalists being creative in how they craft that, while then possibly prompting an investigation from one of those agencies would probably be the best protection as it relates to how the law, the legal framework, not in terms of pure journalistic practice, but in terms of how that law is structured.
Okay, Dennis wants to comment as well. So go ahead.
In the comparative analysis, if you look back at recent performance of the UK and the US, to the question that was coming online, you had, I think it was year before last, the murder of the killing of a journalist on UK. You also had issues with, you have persons who would have been, maybe not jailed, but you had, his name slips me now, it will come back to me. But if you go States, you have United States slipping in its ranking, and I don't think anybody can. I'm getting a feedback, that's why I'm being thrown off. I don't think anyone can question the US is slipping in the rankings. The US the report actually stated last year, never before have US journalists been subjected to so many death threats and turned so often to private security firms for protection. You had several journalists being beaten up as a result of asking questions. They've been physically attacked. 46 journalists have been physically attacked since 2017. That hasn't happened in Jamaica. You also have a president like Donald Trump, who the report says exacerbates press freedom problems with repeated declarations that journalists are an enemy of the American people. So in that regard, I think it is clear that while these countries are developed economies and very established democracies, they have fundamental problems with press freedom in the last few years that we have seen that we do not. And things that have happened there could never happen in Jamaica.
Dennis, question here from David Smith. Is the prevalence of investigative journalism and the consequences of those investigations related to press freedom? Is the press more free in countries where the press cover fewer stories that result in politicians demitting public office?
I do not think, I spoke to that issue too when I was addressing earlier on. The concern is going to be whether the systems, the groundwork is present to allow for investigative journalism. Clearly, there is need for more. We've heard the concerns over and over, and I'd like to endorse that there is need for more investigative or what's understood to be investigative journalism. But I do not think that it is because the systems, the policies, the laws that exist here do not facilitate that. Certainly, you would recall that on many occasions, our journalists have gone and have dug deep and have presented to you information that only a good investigative journalist can find. So I really want you to think in terms of what exists in Jamaica. Are the conditions right for what's understood to be investigative journalism? And I'd say yes.
Thanks, Damion. Question from Matonda Makulu. Has there been any critical examination of appeals by media houses to the Access to Information Appeal Tribunal? What has been the experience of the media houses when they appeal decisions? All right, first of all, in relation to whether the appeals by media houses to the ATI Tribunal critical examination. Okay. I'm actually doing some research on that as I speak. So I won't comment any further on that other than to say I'm not aware of other research having been done on it. What's the experience of the media houses when they appeal decisions? Okay, just by way of information there, remember when you make an application for access to information, if it is turned down, you can then ask for what's known as an internal review, which means the permanent secretary in the ministry generally would review your request. If you still don't get an answer that's favorable to you, that is when you're allowed to move on to the Access to Information Tribunal. I have to tell you, Matondo, from what I've been seeing and my experience so far is, in fact, I have not seen so far, and I've been looking through the rulings of the tribunal, I have not so far seen a single case in which a media house has gone to the tribunal. And I'm not sure if it's because they're getting what they want or if it's that they're dropping the request. Anecdotally, I think that at least in some cases, requests when they're refused are not necessarily pursued to the full extent of the law.
Assessed is the relevance of some of those bits of information, because generally what you find is that on your first request, you're getting some letter back to you to indicate that the ATI unit is asking for another 30 days to respond to you. And as is the case in Guyana, we do have that case here too. When you're getting back the information family from the ATI units, it's irrelevant.
Yeah, the law allows state agencies with information in the first instance up to 30 days to give you the information that you're requesting. At the end of that 30 days, you can request an additional 30 days. If it is that, I'm trying to remember the exact language in the statute. I think it's something like with reasonable cause. In real life, though, There is no assessment of the reasons that they give. You make the request, and at the end of the 30 days, you get a letter saying, we need that on a 30 days. And then, what's that?
Perfectly timed.
Yes, 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 in many cases. And that, in fact, is one of the criticisms of our access to information law. When you look at, for instance, the ESCAZO agreement, which is the regional agreement that deals with access to environmental information, which Jamaica has signed but not yet ratified. One of the requirements under the ESCAZO agreement is that the additional time that is given is not supposed to be more than 10 days. So you can see the kind of difference there, and that's one of the things we would have to be looking at if we were going to ratify. Comment from Dr. Hume Johnson. There is a decline in political and civil liberties in Western democracies broadly. Despite some erosion of public confidence in the media in America in the Trump years, US media does rigorous work and has robust protection in the Constitution, which Jamaican journalists do not have. Okay, I think that's part of what I was alluding to as well during my presentation, Hume. Thank you so very much for that. I did want, I'm just checking while I speak, right? I did want, though, to ask whether or not, in fact, Dennis, I thought, was making a really excellent point that I actually haven't heard ventilated before in terms of what the phrase he used, known as Western bias. And looking at the African countries in particular. I was wondering, Dennis, Jamaica is seen as such a westernized country. So would it be then that that kind of Western bias would be in our favor? And that if there is a correction for that, would it affect perhaps how we're viewed?
Thanks for the question. And I do think so, again, because I connect so much of our performance to the pursuit of the Human Development Index and the way that's measured. So in that regard, I do think that the Western bias does favor us in that some of the objectives of our policies have moved in that direction. I have looked at the UNESCO ranking, or not ranking, because it's not even a ranking, and I don't know how that helps us, which is why I think that we can look at both. The UNESCO, for instance, or the African approach might be another way of looking at our performance or our press freedom, but I still think in terms of producing a qualitative yardstick that we can do comparative analysis with, I do appreciate the RWB approach or Freedom House approach, and I do lean towards it very strongly. I appreciate it.
Earlier, in respect of whether journalism is freer in countries where it's not leading to, or the work of journalists not leading to politicians leaving office. I think to a very great extent, we have to look at these issues in respect of the accountability from the leader of the day. I mean, Jamaica has had a history of reassignments across both administrations, reassignment of a minister from one minister to another when there is some adverse finding. And that is seen to be the quote unquote punishment for the behavior. So if we're going to be looking purely at the work of the journalist to get a minister fired or to get a senior government representative fired, we have to take into account what exists in the system of governance and whether we really have a Westminster system of government, or is it a very bastardized version of what really should be a Westminster system of government that allows for and demands accountability.
Go ahead. That issue, the way the question was phrased, I actually wrote that the two are not necessarily linked because the investigative report is not necessarily directly therefore linked with the demission of office of an elected official. So there has been enough instances of allegations of corruption, poor performance, but the accountability on the part of the elected official, and I like how Damion phrased it, within the Westminster system that we practice here in Jamaica, I think is the disconnect between the link of those two. So the work could be done, it can be presented, reports can be done, stories can be done for days, but what happens at the end of it is not linked directly to the report being done, however brilliant.
All right, question from Sharika, very good initiative, PAJ. Thank you so much, Sharika. She asked, though, is it time, though, for media professionals to be regulated in the same manner as other professional groups? Okay, before I say anything to that, let me ask each of you to comment on that. Damion, and of course, Dennis as well, if he wishes. Go ahead, Damion.
Well, personally, I would not have a difficulty with any regulation. I mean, I think, though, that has to be a consultative process with what the rules, the regulations are going to be, who are going to be these regulators, and is there going to be any political appointee, or is there going to be any scope or opportunity for political involvement? But I personally don't have any difficulty with regulation. And critically, though, it should not be impacting the work of the journalist in seeking to pursue the truth at all times.
Issue being raised, I think 2010, 2011, when we were looking at the Code of Ethics and Practice and the Constitution the second time as well being raised. And we had made provisions to include the council in the Code of Ethics, council which would, I guess, receive reports, examine it, etc. So to the question of regulation, Damion raised my sole point, which is who are the regulators. That I think is my primary concern. Other persons have raised questions as it relates to some sort of licensing or that sort of regulation, like the nurses or doctors or so on, or some sort of council, which is what the PAJ at the time had proposed. So it's not an against. My chief concern is the who, and who determines what issues would then, let's say, result in a yanking of a license or non-practicing or so on.
Dennis, I don't know if you wish to comment.
Thanks. It is something that I've battled with when I used to comment on these types of matters. I remember when you were president, Mr. Jackson Miller, people, were trying to hold you to do the same thing, to hold journalists to account. I've seen people do it to George as well. And, because the question is who, where do you turn to? Is it the Press Association? Is it the Media Association? Where do you turn? One of my big challenges, and I raised it before, is the dynamics of a small island developing state. In terms of, as a small space, where do you find the people? How do you appoint them? It is very problematic. And I just really don't know how we would do so. Do you pull different representatives from the MAJ in order to form this? Do you have kind of a council of elder statesmen and stateswomen from the journalistic profession? It's not like the GLC for lawyers. It does not operate the same way. And I would just say that I think by now it has been debated so much that if it was an easy thing to do, it would be done already. The truth is that it is something that I would like to see taken on. It is just something that I think will prove very difficult within our small spaces. It's one of the challenges of practicing journalism in a physically small country.
Okay, let me just say we've come to the end of our time on JNN. I'm going to say thanks to our viewers on JNN for having been with us. We really do appreciate it. We're going to be continuing for a few more minutes with our broadcast on YouTube and in the Zoom. So once again, thank you so much for having been with us, and you can switch to YouTube now if you wish to continue, as I said, for a few more minutes. I just want to add to the issue of government regulation, because the question, is it time for media professions to be regulated in the same manner as other professional groups? And what my colleagues have been saying, I believe, is that government regulation would be extremely undesirable, correct? because for obvious reasons, government regulation of media brings immediate concerns about censorship, suppression, and a reduction in press freedom. Most schemes, for want of a better word, that have been implemented and tried involve either the use of some kind of press complaints council, media complaints council, or some kind of media ombudsman. Now we actually had an entire forum on this a couple of years ago, but let me just say very quickly, the Press Association of Jamaica is on record as supporting self-regulation and the kind of, whether it's Council of Elders that Dennis was speaking about or some other configuration, but that would be led by the press itself. The difficulty with implementing such a scheme is that the Media Association of Jamaica, that's the media bosses, separate from the journalists in the Press Association of Jamaica, the Media Association of Jamaica is on record as refusing to support the idea of any kind of press complaints council for the industry. Without the media owners, it cannot be implemented. So by all means, we continue to have the conversation. If members of the public think this is something that needs to be done, you need to continue to press for it, but that is where we are. You have, for instance, the RGR Gleaner group that has in place, or is it the Gleaner that has in place an ombudsman, for instance, but there is currently no kind of scheme across the industry. Go ahead.
Well, while you look for that, Dionne, I just want to go back to something that Dennis seems to have said. Am I right in interpreting what you have said, Dennis, concerning the Prime Minister Holness's 2019 comment that the PM was not scolding the media? Essentially, what he was asking is for people to look at the problems with social media. Is that interpretation of mine correct? I'm not hearing. You seem to be muted.
I think when you unmute, back.
I can only unmute when I'm allowed. Right.
Okay, go ahead now, Dennis.
Right. What I was saying is that my interpretation of what he said at the time, he was, yes, responding to what he felt was inaccurate reporting of him or his administration. That is one thing. And he was the handling of facts. But what he was saying is, in today's media landscape, you no longer have to turn to one source. You have a multiplicity of sources. You can go to YouTube, you can go to Facebook, you can go to party sources, you can go here, you can go there, etc., which is a point that any media trainer in this day and age would tell any staff that they are training, that in today's society, with a multiplicity of sources, that you, the mainstream media, have to be on point because people can turn to other sources now, that there are other platforms, that the content creators have the power. Sometimes they have a greater platform than the mainstream media houses by sheer dint of their volume of followers. And so for me, all he was saying was that you have options and you can explore all options in assessing the narrative, which is something that us in mainstream media, you in mainstream media must be cognizant of.
The first point that you seem to have discarded, and that is the Prime Minister's reference was that he was listening to the news en route to the political platform in Tivoli in 2019. And this is what he said about the news. It does not have to be the truth. It does not have to relate to the facts. It is their opinion. And you have no concern with that?
Look, I'm not here to defend the Prime Minister. That's not what I was making the comment in passing. I'm saying my interpretation at the time was that he was saying that he was listening to the news and he heard something that was not factual. It was more opinionated. And he took issue with that, how he chose to take issue with it. I'm not trying to defend the Prime Minister. I'm saying that was my interpretation of what he said. And he was saying, he went on to say other things, no matter how inelegant you might want to say, to treat with it. I am just saying, from me, what I took from it is the part of, I wasn't offended by the first part. What I took from it was, we in mainstream media have a great deal of responsibility in being the guardians of fact. And that we must, when everybody else in the noise of the media landscape are saying all sorts of things, we must be the ones who people turn to for the facts. But what happens when the people who you turn to for the facts are actually incorrect or stubbornly incorrect? What happens then? I mean, I was using that to make another point, and I don't want to get hung up with that because I don't want to.
Few more questions before we wrap up. In fact, Dennis, a couple of lots of interest in the points you've been making. So I'm just going to ask you to stay on to answer the next question, which is Claire Grant is asking if you're suggesting that social media is the equivalent of a professional media house.
I'm saying the opposite. One of the challenges of the social media age is that it has facilitated an explosion of broadcasters who are not necessarily journalists. And with this explosion of broadcasters, you have an explosion of platforms that are competing, which is why mainstream media is still relevant in a context of social media. Because when somebody questions, did you hear about the this or did you hear about the that? Did you hear that a plane crashed on the beach? The first thing I do is I check certain journalists, I check certain media houses at which they work, and I see, is it being reported by them? Because why? I turn to them for the facts. I want to know what credible journalism is reporting. However, we have seen where media houses have reported stories and persons will say, public figures will say, I didn't say that. And when you play the entirety of an interview, that you see that actually what they're saying is accurate. So what they're saying is, I have to have a platform where my content is pushed out, or an agency or a company says, we have to have our platform where our content is pushed out to push our narrative, because sometimes media narratives or headlines or what have you don't necessarily capture what we believe were all of the facts. And so, you know, it's something that we have to contend with, that there is now a multiplicity of sources for narratives, and people are pushing competing narratives. That's the media landscape within which we operate. And some of it is journalism, some of it is broadcaster. Not everybody is a journalist, and not every journalist is adhering to the canons of the profession as others are. You know, but I don't know if that answers the question.
Dennis, all right. Final question. Andre Shackelford says, to the panelists, how do you think the RGR Gleaner merger has affected press freedom as a condition of the merger? It was required that the two newsrooms be kept separate. Has that been maintained practically? Has that been maintained? And has that restricted the types of thoughts, viewpoints, and approaches? Well, let me say, as somebody out of the RGR Gleaner newsroom, the separation has been maintained. the editorial planning, the editorial decisions are entirely separate. I know what's coming out in the Gleaner when it comes out online or in the paper, just like you guys. They jealous, and Damion can comment, they jealously guard their stories. Trust me, we read the stories and then we're like, okay, let me follow up on this in the same way I'd follow up on something in the Observer. So you will see synergies at some level, maybe social media and so on, but in terms of the actual journalistic editorial work in the newsroom, we're completely separate still.
Agree with that. I mean, my only concern, and I think I've made this public, had to do with the plurality you'd have had on the radio, for example, with different news houses and different news teams, as opposed to now, which exists with simulcasting of some of the news broadcast on the stations and the group. That for me is the only concern in respect of editorial functions. But I think to a very great extent, both newsrooms have remained independent. And as Dionne has said, they do not get our story until tomorrow morning.
Okay. We're wrapping up. I'm going to go to final comments from all the panelists, just to say where I think that it has affected the media is by reducing the number of outlets for employment for journalists. It used to be that as somebody at RGR TVJ, you could go look at a job at Gleaner or vice versa. And with the concentration of media in fewer hands, it's a bad thing for journalists and for media workers, especially in a small society. Let me just ask Marilyn, as somebody who is currently not in the newsroom, to comment quickly on that, and then final comments from our panelists as we wrap.
Initial comment was, or observation is that it has not. However, I would say that it does have the potential to. I did note the reduction in the plurality of voices, but on another point, which I haven't heard raised, you raised the economic as it relates to the journalists themselves. But looking at the situation where a few years ago, or even just prior to the merger, especially as it relates to concerns regarding newspapers and their survival, and a lot of the smaller stations, apologies for terming the station smaller, but a lot of the smaller stations and their economic viability, I think the merger has aided that in terms of you do have the stations remaining on air, and that I guess crossing of the finances can aid that, and that is also a measure. So I think that has helped. So just in summary, it has not so far. It does have the potential to do so though, and one strength is the economic. We're not closing the stations because of the merger.
15 seconds, final comment.
Thank
you.
you.
Want to leave us with?
I want to say that the main thought that has remained with me tonight is the ability to engage in this way, the ability that we have as members of the press, media workers, former media workers, communication practitioners, to debate regardless of the point. I think when I think of freedoms and when I think of freedom of expression, that is what comes to mind. And as it relates to the Jamaican landscape, whether it's a letter to the editor, a call on a radio station, a call-in program utilizing your social media, or journalists writing or investigating, we are not suppressed in our freedom to express.
Damion?
I just want to use the opportunity to again highlight something that Dennis has pointed out. There are instances, and there will be instances in the future, when human beings we call journalists get things wrong. What's going to be very important is how that newsroom treats that incorrect information, to accept that you are wrong, to correct it, to put systems in place to prevent a repeat, and to move forward. And I would like to take a second to also address the issue of narrative setting. Yes, we are in that era when narrative setting is finite. And I think to a great extent, it behoves the journalist to search for and report the truth, because there can only be one of that.
And Dennis, final comment.
Thank you very much. I just like to say I really appreciated being a part of this discussion. I think it was very much in line with, you know, what we would have wanted to get out of it. For me, I am very passionate about democracy, about democratic evaluation, and looking at where we are as a people, as a society. And I very much value the role of the journalistic profession in the democracy, in the guarding of the democracy. I think that over the past 4.5 years as we've observed in the United States, you know, one of the good things that is that it has taught us that democracy, there's no magic fairy dust that makes it work. Democracy takes hard work. And journalism, the fourth estate, if you want to call it that, is a crucial element of the democratic architecture and the democratic political culture. So for me, the role of journalists, I don't know that sometimes we realize how important our role is to democracy and freedom in general. So for me, press freedom is of great value and great importance to what we are trying to do as Project Jamaica. And so whatever we can do to improve it, to enrich it, I think we have to do that because the democracy depends on it.
Marilyn is begging.
Said as it relates to journalists getting things wrong and then the steps that are there. I don't want to give the impression that the aggrieved person has to rely upon the good graces of the media house to address that situation. So the question came to mind, does the aggrieved have avenues for redress and sufficient avenues for redress? And in this democracy, yes, the aggrieved does. So it's not just relying upon the good graces that the journalist or the media house recognizes the error and takes the necessary step. You do have other steps that you can take, including legislative, including utilizing other avenues which are free and open.
Thank you so much. Okay, that's a note on which we are pulling the curtains down for this 2020 Press Association of Jamaica Forum. Let me first just apologize for the technical problems we're having with Dennis's audio, both to Dennis as well as to all of you participating. But I have to say that even with those problems, I thought his comments and his contributions were so important and so on point. I'm so happy, Dennis, you were still able to participate. I want to say once again, special thanks to all of you for being with us, those of you on YouTube, those of you in the Zoom, and I noticed that robust and a lot of interactive discussions were taking place in both spaces. So I was really happy to be seeing that as we went along. And of course, very, very special thanks to our sponsors. And I'm so happy to see that all the representatives stayed with us right to the very end. We must be doing something right. Thank you. Thank you so much, UK High Commissioner, His Excellency Asif Ahmad. Also with us, we had Political Counsel at the Canadian High Commission, Kevin Gilhooly, as well as Her Excellency Ambassador Marian Van Steen from the EU delegation. Of course, special thanks to JNN and Michael Sharp and his team, and of course to my colleagues of the Press Association of Jamaica. Just to remind you that the National Journalism Awards take place on Saturday starting at 6, and those also will be live streamed on YouTube, since we're not going to be able to have an audience for that either because of COVID-19. So we hope to see you on YouTube. I'm Dionne Jackson Miller. And JNN, I do beg your pardon. And JNN, big deal there. All right, I'm Dionne Jackson Miller. Do enjoy the rest of your evening and stay safe.